Hello, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Eric Stein. I'm a member of the American Technion Society National Board and a co-chair of the Marketing Committee. I'm from Boca Raton, Florida, and I'm so happy to be with you today for this exciting program. Today we are discussing the upcoming launch of a new book and a new look into the uniqueness of the Technion and by extension the State of Israel. We hear about Technion innovation often, but what does that mean? And perhaps more importantly, as supporters of the Technion, how has that innovation become the engine that drives not only additional support of the Technion, but Israel at large? Our guest today may have the answers. Technion professor Shlomo Maital literally wrote the book on Technion's impact on Israel with the publication of the Technion Nation in 2013. It tells how a small country with limited resources became a powerhouse of scientific advances, largely due to a university founded before the state was established. Shlomo is head of the Tzvi Grilichus Research Data Center at the Technion's Samuel Neiman Institute for National Policy Research and a pioneer in action learning methods for executives and entrepreneurs. Shlomo, along with his colleague from the Neiman Institute, Rafi Nave, have written a new book that delves deeper into the mystique of the Technion's impact. It is called Aspiration, Inspiration, Perspiration: How Technion faculty and graduates fuse creativity with technology to change the world. In it, Shlomo and Rafi, who himself is a remarkable Technion innovator and a member of the team who brought us the pill cam, interviewed 100 innovators to find out how the Technion's academics and atmosphere fostered a world-changing fusion of creative thinking that enabled some of the most incredible technologies we've seen, and what their advice is for future generations. Joining Shlomo and Rafi today is one of the innovators featured in the book, former Executive Vice President and Chief Product Officer at Intel, Dadi Perlmutter. We will be privy to a conversation among these three outstanding researchers and have a glimpse into the making of the special sauce that fosters the ingenuity that leads to world-changing advances. Please use the chat button, the chat function key on your webinar screen to submit your questions for any or all of our guests today, and we will incorporate as many of your questions into the conversation as we can. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to turn things over to Professor Shlomo Maital.
Eric, thank you very much. And thanks to you and your foundation for supporting the printing of Technion Nation that made it possible. So I wrote Technion Nation with my friend, Professor Amnon Frankel, partly to correct an injustice. Sinor and Singer's wonderful book, Startup Nation, printed millions of copies. It's done wonders for Israel's public relations, but in it, Technion's mentioned only briefly. The truth is, Startup Nation began here at the Technion in Professor Kidron's microelectronics lab. The first Israeli entrepreneur was Uzziah Galil, Technion graduate. He started Elron in 1961. Sadly, he recently passed away. One Technion graduate in every 4 launches a startup. We've done a survey. Technion graduates not only launch startups, they manage them. And our women graduates too, they launch startups. 1 female alum in every 7, and that proportion is growing. Technion graduates and faculty fuse creativity and technology, as you mentioned, Eric, to make Israel and the whole world smarter, healthier, happier. Those who would boycott Israel, there are a lot, maybe they should refrain from using anything Israelis and Technion invented. They wouldn't have much of a life if they did. So there's a famous poem by a poet named Sam Walter Foss. It's called The House by the Side of the Road. The poet says, "Let me live in my house by the side of the road where the race of men go by." I've been blessed to live here at the Technion by the side of the road for 42 years, since 1979. As one who studies creativity and innovation, I've watched hundreds, thousands of brilliant innovators on Technion on the road to innovation. Now, I haven't been on that road myself, So today I'm bringing you two of Technion's great innovators who did take that road. This is the horse's mouth. And as I tell my students, look, I'm just a professor. I'll give you a lot of free advice. Take it with a grain of salt. Go and listen to the innovators themselves. So here they are. Two Technion alumni. Rafi, first employee of Intel Israel, led the highly complex development of the 8087 math coprocessor. This put Israel Intel on the map. Dadi spearheaded the Pentium, the Centrino core, Intel #2 executive worldwide. So we use the phrase to change the world. We use it kind of loosely, but these two have changed our world for the better. There's a Yiddish saying, for instance, is not a proof. In Yiddish, a Beispiel is nicht a Derweis. But it is, a Beispiel is a Derweis. So here with us are two proofs that Technion generates world-changing creativity by fusing technology and creativity. So we host many visitors at Technion, and they all want to know the Technion secret sauce for effective creativity. I think Rafi and I found a recipe by interviewing 100 Technion innovators. 3 ingredients, as Eric mentioned: aspiration, aim really high, tackle really hard problems, don't be afraid; inspiration, extreme out-of-the-box thinking; and not least, most important, perspiration, really very hard work. So our guests, Rafi and Dadi, have each applied this 3-part recipe, and they changed the world, truly without exaggeration. And we're going to hear their stories as live case studies. And I'm going to turn to my friend and office mate, Rafi, with the first question. And Rafi, let's begin with aspiration. So you were actually the first official employee of Intel's Haifa Design Center, and you were general manager of Intel Israel from 1981 to 1985. On your watch, Intel's famous 8087 math coprocessor was developed. The purpose of the math coprocessor was crucial. It was to speed up arithmetic calculations and math functions. It was the most complex product that Intel had designed up to that time. It's considered one of the main reasons why IBM picked Intel to make the microprocessors for the first IBM PC. It made Intel the semiconductor leader for 3 decades. Put Intel Israel on the map, proving no challenge was too great for the Israeli team. So Rafi, tell us, how did your Israeli team, with many Technion grads, how did you dare to take the risk and accept this huge challenge? No assurance that you'd succeed.
Okay, thank you. Let me take you back actually to July 1st, 1974. In 1 week, we're going to celebrate the 47th anniversary of the opening of the Intel Israel Design Center. At the time, we started 4 engineers, okay? And in last count, Intel has over 14,000 employees now in Israel. Of these, about 4,000 chip designers. So our chip design count grew 1,000-fold since the beginning. In the first 3.5 years, we did sort of, let's call it Me Too products. They were not too complex because they looked at us as, as infants, as toddlers, as people who still need to learn how to do things. And then one day in December of 1977, our general manager, Eli Purat, calls me in the office and says, Intel is introducing shortly a new microprocessor, the 8086, and they figured that they would like to accompany that processor, a math coprocessor that is going to do all the calculations. And this product is very complex, to the point where nobody in Santa Clara wants to get close to it because they are afraid that it cannot be implemented. So go find out what's going on. So I went on a 2-week trip to Santa Clara. I talked with anybody who had anything to do with it, starting with Andy Grove, all the way at the top, Jean-Claude Cornet, who was the manager of the design team, Bill Pullman, who was in charge of the microprocessors, and then the architects, the floating point unit people, and so on and so forth, and learned within 2 weeks whatever you can learn about it. And also, you could tell that they were really, really concerned that it's so complicated that at the time it cannot be implemented, because it was about 3 times more complex than the microprocessor itself, by transistor count, by the complexity of the functions in it, and so on. So I went back to Israel and came to Eli and told him, you know, it's really a tough decision, because we set up ourselves for failure. On the other hand, everybody knows it's going to fail. So if we fail, we just fulfill whatever they thought about. But if by any chance we succeed, okay, it's going to be a real breakthrough. So let's take it and see what happens. So we took upon ourselves to implement the product. And for the next 1.5 years, we had a team of about 8 engineers and another 8 mass designers who worked really around the clock, you know, from dawn till midnight every day on this product.
Perspiration.
Yeah, well, yeah, but it took a lot of inspiration as well.
Okay.
And you know, you inspire not by words, but rather by deeds. So personally, I was there with the team day and night as well. And by accident, my first child was born on February 78. So his first 1.5 years, he barely saw me. Okay. In any case, back to the team, I think they did wonders. And the chip came out about slightly less than 2 years from the beginning, and it almost worked perfectly on the first round. We needed some touch-ups, but basically it worked. And it was introduced about half a year later, and it was really well accepted by the community. As you mentioned, some people claim that the reason that IBM picked Intel rather than Motorola, you know, the 8086 or 8088 versus the Motorola 6800 was because Intel had a math coprocessor while Motorola didn't have anything comparable. I don't know if that's true or not. If it is true, then that sets the fate of Intel for the following 4 decades, because it's been the leader of the microprocessor and PC world for the following 30 to 40 years. Also, there were years, especially in the second half of the 1980s, where the math processors was the most profitable product line, and it kept Intel above water as far as profitability and as far as its sales. As you mentioned, after we did that, you know, which was the most complex product Intel ever made, nobody could claim, hey, Intel Israel cannot cope with this or that, whatever, because we've shown that anything you can do, I can do better, okay? Okay. Last but not least, the product implemented the IEEE 754 standard. It was a new standard that was championed by Professor Weber Kahn from Berkeley and the others, which set a new standard for accurate computation, for reliable calculations, and so on. That to this day, okay, one of the reasons that airplanes do not fall, the robots do their work accurately, that all financial systems work, and so on, as they do, is this IEEE 754 standard, and the fact that the 8087 was the product that implemented it for the first time. So back to this motto, I would say we needed aspiration. Actually, we needed chutzpah, I mean, to take it upon ourselves, and we did that. We needed inspiration because, again, the team needed this goal in front of their mind so that they will really do creative things, sometimes almost impossible things. And I don't have time to go into details and examples, but they really did wonders on some of the solutions they did, and lots of perspiration. So I believe that overall, I'm very, very proud of the product and its impact.
And fast forward, of course, Rafi, Intel is crucially important for Israel, the large employer, the largest exporter, I believe, vitally important for our economy.
Actually, last year they did $8 billion of export, which is by far from Israel, which is by far the largest exporter.
Wow. Dadi, we'll move on to you and we'll talk about inspiration. So Dadi, today we all walk around with smartphones, with these things. We're connected 24/7, anywhere, everywhere, all the time. We take it for granted, like this always was. Dadi, you sold this idea to Intel via the Centrino chipset, software, hardware that would greatly expand laptop battery life and enable us to work anywhere for 8 hours, always connected with Wi-Fi. And the mantra was unwire your world. And we all did, and we have. Smartphones today, they're really just small laptops. So the Centrino went directly against Intel's core marketing strategy. That was to sell megahertz, speed, power. And Dadi, it was a hard sell. It involves some chutzpah. How did you sell this idea, and where did you get the vision for an unwired world?
Well, thank you, Shlomo. It was probably one of the great achievements. In today's world, we are now using Zoom or whatever video conferencing. It was a completely unthought of just 20 years ago. That any kid could could not go to school because of COVID, could turn on a notebook connected to Wi-Fi at home, and voila. The teacher speaks, the students learn. It was not as easy as it is. And it really fulfilled the vision that we had then that called anytime, anywhere. At that time, I'm talking about the 1990s, we all, or some of us remember, my kids don't, my girl can never saw them, this big, beige, ugly desktop that sat on your desk, relatively small screen. And notebooks have been very few. They were called portable. They were about 2 inches thick, very heavy, and mainly people used it to move from their office to the conference room and back, connecting to the wall. So how is that all started? Like any big inventions, it started with a big failure. The late 1990s, Intel were through all the 80s and 1990s, the king of the PC. And when you are so successful, competitors want to take a bite on your success. So few companies came, they couldn't win against Intel on delivering a high-performing desktop processor, so they created a chip. And at that time, whoever remembers what was in the 1990s, Intel sold the goodness of the microprocessor by the speed at which the processor ran. It called the megahertz. How many cycles per second does the CPU operates on? And Intel convinced everyone that the larger the number is, the better the product. So if you bought 2 years ago a 100 megahertz product, today we have 150, and of course you'll pay a bit more, and you'll be so happy to replace your old machine by a new one. But these competitors came with the different ways of doing things, and they came and started biting Intel at the low end and taking bigger and bigger market segment share away from Intel. That was very painful, and Intel management was all over the place with respect to finding a solution. It was a big meeting, I remember, in Portland, Oregon, where all the microprocessor division sat around the table, tried to figure out what it is. It was very interesting. Every VP was pointing on his friend saying, you should do that low-end product, because as a matter of fact, nobody really knew how to do it. So I decided to jump in and volunteer with the good support of my management team. We sat down overnight and I said, we are going to volunteer to do this crazy idea. We don't know how to do that. We'll figure that out. At least we have something in our hand. And, Rafi talked about doing the coprocessor, but the king of the hill was the microprocessor. And at that time, Intel Israel was never given the charter to do a microprocessor. So we said, well, it's an opportunity. We'll do a microprocessor and we'll run a business for Intel. To make the long story short, I stood in front of the few hundreds Rafi talked about 4,000. At that time, we had about 300, 400 engineers at Intel in Haifa. And I said, this is our charter, this is what we need to do. And we have to do it, and we have to cut the cost of a microprocessor by 50%. Well, I said that. It was wonderful. I'm the boss. I gave the direction and moved away. Well, everybody was in horror because nobody had a clue. A week later, two engineers came to me in the corridor and said, Dadi, we have an idea. If you are going to give up on how fast the processor works by 10%, we could cut the cost by 50. I said, you are idiots, you don't understand the business, go away. Well, they haven't. Thanks God for that. They came to me and said, we can prove it to you. They took 2 weeks, they showed it possible. And we created a product to Intel that could, by cutting the speed by 10%, we could cut the cost by 50%. This product failed miserably, not because of this idea, but because we chose a different technology of memory. I will not go to the details of this one. I took the blame for that because it was a bad decision to be done. And we sat in Haifa and said, what the hell is going on? We spent 300 people, about $500 million for a few years to develop a product that nothing came out of it. What do we do? Well, these two engineers came back. They said, there is another thing that we realized. It's not just saving the cost by 50%, we also save power by 50%. So the question was, what the hell we are doing with this great phenomenon? And another engineer came up. I'd love to say that it was my ideas, it was not. I had a very innovative team that had huge amount of ideas all the time. And I said, if we do a notebook processor, not for desktop, but a notebook, the fact that it runs so low on power, you could make the processor way thinner because you don't have to dissipate heat. And you can make the battery life way better. And then came the idea, if you put also a wireless communication via a technology that was very new in the 1990s called Wi-Fi. Now everybody knows what the Wi-Fi is. At the time, nobody knew how to spell a Wi-Fi. Everybody thought we were talking about hi-fi, high fidelity music. And we came with this idea to Intel. And Intel said, you're idiots. We cannot sell a product when it's slower than the desktop processor. And I convinced Intel. It was a long way to convince Intel. The key meeting was, believe it or not, at September 11, 2001. There was a big decision that the go, no go among many other products at Intel was on the table. Intel being Intel, you don't cancel the big meeting just because a few airplanes get into the Twin Towers in New York. And after a big debate where I was called an idiot, a liar, don't understand the business, the executive VP at that time that eventually became the Intel CEO decided to bet on this one. Said, it's a good idea, we'll see how it goes out. And they funded not just the development, they funded a completely new branding because we knew that the deficiency in the speed should be overcome by telling other things. This is where the unwire and the and anytime, anywhere. It was amazing that while the Intel people were against it, when we talked to the IBMs of the world, the Dell computers of the world, they loved it. They saw a huge opportunity to come with a new product that they could charge not less, but more than a desktop because the value of people moving around, we had a big program to really install hotspots of Wi-Fi in Starbucks, in the Hilton chain, in all the big airports in the world, because initially we knew that business people would love this. When they go on a big tour, they could go be in a restaurant, be in a cafe, be in a hotel room, and walk and bring their computer with them and do the work. This became a huge success. It's quite amazing. Within 5 years, basically from 10%, notebooks became about 70 to 80% of all PCs sold. Wi-Fi became ubiquitous. You won't find any device, either it is a PC, a cell phone, or what have you, that doesn't have this capability. So that was an amazing one. I always say that two big lessons I learned from this one. One, big successes come from a failure because the failure throw you on a completely different trajectory that you probably would have not. I don't think you would have thought about doing this notebook processor and the whole thing without failing on this low-cost processor. And the other one is that the big changes come from below. The big ideas, if you are, as a leader, as a manager, allow people to bring their innovative idea. Some of them could be stupid, some of them could be wrong, but nevertheless, they have to be, I still owe my career to these two engineers that bump into me in the corridor and at the chutzpah, as Rafi called it, to go tell me that I'm an idiot, they have a solution and that you go follow them. I was not that smart and it took me about 2 weeks to be convinced. So this is the story.
So,
And they were Technion graduates.
Both, it's most of they were both good. Well, I should have mentioned that. It seemed obvious to me, so well, thank you.
it's obvious. So Rafi and Dadi, I have a little sticker on my laptop that says Intel inside. I guess it could say maybe Israel inside, perhaps. Thank you, Dadi. That was fascinating. Let me remind our participants, you have a golden opportunity. We have two great innovators here. You can submit your questions. We'll try to respond to some of them and we'll respond to all of them by email. Rafi, let's talk about perspiration. So today, gastroenterologists, doctors who examine our intestinal tract, they have a new high-tech tool they never dreamed of in the past. Part of our intestines were dark areas, inaccessible. It's a tiny pill cam, and you swallow it, and it has a tiny video camera inside, and it sends video pictures of your gastrointestinal tract, including parts that never could be seen or accessed. This was done by a company called Given Imaging startup. Yeah, you were vice president of Given Imaging. It took many years from the initial crazy idea, a pill cam small enough to swallow, with a video camera and a radio transmitter. Crazy idea. It was a conversation between a medical doctor and an engineer, Israeli engineer in Boston. And it took many years of hard work until the final FDA approval. Can you tell us, how does a near impossible idea become reality?
Okay, first of all, unlike the first story, this one I was not party to. I joined Given Imaging 10 years after it started. So I led the team on some of the following products, but not on the initial product. You need a little education on the medical aspects of that. If you go back to high school, you remember that our body, in it there is the digestive system. Namely, you put the food, you get the food in from the mouth, it travels through some pipes along the way, and eventually some of it makes its way out in the other end. Now, as you mentioned, gastroenterologists, these are the people who are dealing with that, can access the first 1.5 meters from the top. They have what is called an endoscope that you shove into your mouth, and it goes through the esophagus into the stomach and the duodenum, and that's about it. They can also go from the other hand through what is called the colon or the large bowel. The problem is in the middle, we have 6 to 7 meters of what is called the small bowels that you cannot access either from the top or from the bottom. And up until the 80s and 90s, the gastrologists were really helpless. Here comes this patient and he complains that he has a bellyache, he has some diarrhea, some constipation, whatever it is. And they try from the top, try from the bottom, and they cannot find anything. So they do not know what they should do with this patient. Should they do a surgery in order to fix something? Should they give him a diet? Should they give him some medication? Because they couldn't diagnose what's going on there. So back in 1982, a good friend of mine, Gabi Idan, who was an engineer in the armament authorities, who was designing satellites and rockets, was on sabbatical in Boston, as you mentioned. And you know how it is in Boston, not just in Boston, anywhere when you go on sabbatical, you usually take a flat in a condominium or in a complex and so on. So they have those happy hours, those, barbecues and so on. So in one of those weekends, he met with another Israeli, who is Dr. Eitan Skapa from Asaf Harofeh Hospital, and they were chatting. So Dr. Skapa told him his frustration, I'm really helpless. What should I do? But you're an engineer. Start thinking about it. So Gabi started thinking about it, and then was this what is called the eureka moment. The eureka, the term comes from the good old Greek Archimedes, who went into a bath and figured the rule that your weight is getting the volume of water that it is displacing is equivalent to its weight and so on. I don't want to go into it. But the moment of the inspiration is called eureka. Okay, so he had this eureka moment and he said the following: hey, I'm designing those satellites that are hovering in the sky and they take photos of the terrain and then they retransmit them to the ground. If I could take this satellite, which is 3 meters long, and I could shrink it 100 times, so it is 2.5 or 3 centimeters long, so it could be swallowed, then it could travel through the intestines and take pictures and transmit them to some, recorder or receiver that is on a belt on the person's body. And here the physician could see what's going on inside. Okay. Now, the problem is that was 1982. It took until 1998 until a real product could be developed. The reason was very simple. When Gabi was trying to implement it, it took 20 centimeters, not 2 or 3 centimeters. And you cannot swallow a 20 centimeter thing. So it took another 15 or 16 years until the technology of the mechanical, the optical, the electronics, everything could be shrunk enough to fit into this pill that could be traveling. Still, it was a lot of design work, a lot of people were working hard on it, and then they implemented it. Now, Dadi mentioned the September 11. Well, a few weeks before September 11, this product came out, and actually the company called Given Imaging was introduced, IPO'd in Wall Street. It was the first IPO until after 9/11. It was a big success, and ever since, this product has been a smashing success because it solves a real problem, something that the gastrologists don't have another way of figuring out what's going on in the small bowel. So far, well over 5 million people have digested this pill. It saved probably the lives of about 1 million people, and it bettered the life of another 2 or 3 million people because the physician knew what's going on inside. They knew whether it is a tumor that you need to remove, or it is just an ulcer, or just irritation or something like that, and so on. And we are very, very proud of that product, which is clearly an Israeli innovation. It has been and still does being manufactured in Israel and is being sent to hospitals and clinics all over the world. And it became the standard of medication. Every gastrologist, this is part of his tool set. So we're very, very proud of it.
Thank you. We have a relevant question from participant Michael Miller. So I'm going to ask each of you, but please brief answers if you can, so I can get on to Dadi's second question. Michael asked, is there something about the Technion's approach to teaching that makes such great engineers and scientists and entrepreneurs? You're both Technion graduates. What did you take from Technion, Dadi?
It's a very tough question, and I wish I could give a good answer, but I'll try at least my best. It starts with even before you go to the Technion. Who does the Technion admit to go study engineering, very much electrical engineering or computer science? You have to be at the top of your league, and probably you don't go through this hardship just because you want to do something. It's because you really want to, you're aspired and inspired to do something big. And I think that's a big thing that I believe many of the Technion graduates. And you have to remember that the times that Rafi and I talked about, when all these things started, was way before Startup Nation, way before everybody even knew how to spell a startup. But it had the aspiration to do something big, which I believe the Technion, with the way of teaching, gives you the tools. Because if you think about the way you educate, it's first the knowledge, then the ability to do things, the work in labs. I remember the students came complaining to the professor that the questions in the examinations were very different from the questions that we worked on during the classes. He said, well, you're a student of the Technion, you're going to become an engineer. If I give you questions that I already asked, then it doesn't matter. I don't know anything about you. I thought that this is a fundamental thing that I wish would come also to the overall education system, that the trick is not to chew what you already learned, is to take what you know and try to do something different, which I believe is fundamental to become an entrepreneur or think big about doing things differently than other than chewing and do what you learn.
Thank you, Dadi. And Rafi, briefly, what did you get from
it's very similar. I think the key there is the Technion teaches us how to learn things that you do not know or do not have the data about, and especially the creativity and innovation on, when you're faced with something you haven't seen before, that ability to improvise, that ability to come with an innovative breakthrough is something that it inspires you to do it. It doesn't give you the tool. It's not something you know for sure, but you get the confidence that you can do it. And in many cases, it gets you the intuition to, take some very tough decisions that later on prove correct.
Got it. So we have some really great questions, and we promise we will answer them but offline by email. Dadi, question for you. So the Startup Nation book, it has an idea or theory, hypothesis that chutzpah is Israel's secret sauce. I think Intel's smash hit microprocessor Pentium is a perfect example. So you were a fairly junior engineer at Intel Israel, and you and a colleague or revisor sent a fax to the legendary Intel CEO, Andy Grove, with a sketch of the goose that laid the golden egg on the cover page. And you wrote to the CEO, "You're killing the goose that laid the golden egg." Grove had decided to scrap Intel's existing technology and move to a new one, not compatible with previous software and hardware. I wonder if other CEOs might have fired you on the spot, but Grove invited you to headquarters to Santa Clara. And the super tanker Intel turned on a dime, and the result was the Pentium, maybe Intel's most successful and profitable product. Dadi, tell us the story of the famous fax and the meeting with Andy Grove.
Well, before I go, I'll fix. It was fully compatible with the old software.
Right.
That was the whole beauty without the invention.
Okay.
But I'll start from the beginning. I joined Intel in 1980 after graduating the Technion. 1980 was a very interesting era because it was semiconductor industry was at its infancy. Many people even argue that will not be something big. Microprocessor was completely new. The first microprocessor came out 1974. It was a toy. The 8086, Rafi talked about the 8087 came about late 70s, early 80s. But it was kind of up in the air at Intel. Something big is happening. I doubt if anyone, I definitely didn't think that the microprocessor is going to be basically in semiconductor, the fulcrum of the digital revolution that we all see today and understand. It couldn't have been done without these two things. 1980s was very interesting. Microprocessor was invented by Intel in the 1970s. It was a very complex creature. And people in the 1980s, the smartest on Mother Earth, for thinking about how to make it way better, because everybody thought that microprocessor is going to be it. And Professor Hennessy from the Technion came in the early 80s with a great idea. He said that the microprocessor should be done way easier, way simpler than the way Intel did it. He called it a reduced instruction set computer. Reduced means simpler, while Intel was going as a complex, ugly, old, inefficient. And the whole essence of this RISC processor was that it's simple to design, it's simple to program, it's simple to write program to, it will run faster, and everything else. And Intel was in the middle of it. And I was told, I was not there, I was a young engineer back in Haifa. The Intel chief architect of the 486 told Intel management that he don't know how to do any way beyond what the 486 is, and said Intel should go to this new idea as well. In parallel, I just finished the third generation of the math coprocessor that Rafi described. Its first generation was extremely successful financially, probably its margin was way more than 95%. I don't remember ever any product being that successful financially. And as a result, I was given a program that Intel was asked to do by IBM. IBM in the 1980s was like Google, Facebook, and Apple together.
Amazon.
And Amazon, yeah, that was the big machine. You don't say no to what IBM asked. And IBM asked to do something that would fit their operating system so they could tweak the x86. And I was given the assignment. The general manager of Intel Israel at the time asked me to form a team. We said, we don't understand enough microprocessors. We hired another computer graduate, Dr. Yuri Weiser. He was designing the microprocessor for a competitor, and he came to Intel because he wanted to join the big success of Intel. And it took us few months to realize that the IBM request was really stupid. It wasn't good for IBM, definitely wasn't good for Intel. It was a waste of time. But we learned a lot about the architecture, and we realized that we know what to do to be even better than what Professor Hennessy was proposing for RISC, while still retaining the full software compatibility of the 486, which means all the software, billions of dollars that Microsoft and others already invested on the PC software could be retained. I usually gave an example in one of my talks that it was like in Paris, you go through and the facade of the houses are like the good old Paris everybody loves, but inside they live in apartments that are, 21st century kind of style. Nobody lives in a house like they live in the 19th century. And we start talking to our colleagues and friends and managements in Intel, and we got the kind of, we're ridiculed. You guys in Haifa don't have a clue. We here in California, we understand the business, we understand the technology, we don't know how to do the things, go away, and this is not even your job. Uri was so frustrated, he wanted to resign. He didn't come to Intel. It's interesting that the outsider was the guy that realized that Intel is doing the big mistake of throwing the compatibility under the bus. And he proposed that we'll send a fax to Andy Grove. Why a fax? Because at that time, only engineers had computers and on their desk and could do email, or the others had papers. It was very interesting because Andy Grove could have received a page, something like this one. He could toss it and throw it away. He could, in the way, just call the senior VP that owns microprocessor and ask to get rid of these idiots from Haifa. But he was smart enough to say, we'd better learn what to do here. And he said the senior VP to go figure that out. To make the long story short, this senior VP thought that we have a good merits in our proposal. We had a thick document. The facts were just a cover to get the attention. A thick document, a lot of simulations that showed that we had merit. You know, it was a bittersweet conclusion to this story. The sweet was that this became the Pentium processor. It was a huge success. It basically was the way that the PC became from a commercial device to a consumer device, which means that the PC sales skyrocketed. It was great for Intel, very much from business perspective, and all good. The bitter part was that they said, well, you're in Israel, you still don't mature enough to do a microprocessor. We'll do the design here in California. And we left bitter. It took Intel Israel about 10 years by which we are doing the revolution on the notebooks and the mobile computer and the wireless. And later on, we took this revolution onto the cloud, which is another long story, which I don't think we have time for. But I think that, I have this big lesson. You don't have to take the common wisdom of the big company as, the truth from God. You could have your own ideas. And the last, and you have to have the chutzpah. You have to come in and propose. The interesting story is that I learned from Andy Grove himself years later, that by the time that Intel were playing with doing a RISC processor, Bill Gates was all over Andy Grove saying, if you're throwing away compatibility, I'm going to design new software, but not a new product. So these facts came, fortunately enough, at the right time, at the right place.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you so much, Dadi. We have a question from Larry. We have just a few minutes, so we need a brief answer for a really hard question. Larry asks our two great innovators, what's the next big thing? What should young people be focused on in the realm of technological innovation? Rafi.
Okay, first of all, we see a lot of things happening as we speak. I would focus on technology-based things because there are also a lot of things that have to do with hype and so on and so forth. I think there are several threads that are very promising. One of them is clearly anything to do with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on is now big, and everyone now can spell it and know that it's coming. Another one is cybersecurity, especially since a lot of things start being controlled by machines. Then also this is, an exposure that, also the villains can do bad things to those things. Clearly, there is the issue of automation, be it robotics or be it autonomous cars or be it those drones and so on and so forth. So this is a big thing, and applications that are based on those vehicles or those means for autonomous transportation. And last but not least, the whole domain of personalized medicine, especially based on the fact that we now can map the genome of a person, the DNA, and based on that, you can figure which medication is good or which solution is good for which person and so on. So not giving everybody the same solution, but rather one that is personalized. I think those are just, a few elements that I can think of.
Dadi, the next big thing.
Well, Rafi stole many of the list I had. I'll add few. One is the debate. I talked about semiconductors. That what drives the semiconductor, the famous Moore's law is kind of slowing down. And many people talk about very big innovations. Some of it is by quantum computers, new materials, new capabilities that people talk about for years, but never put the money into this one. I think it will make a big change. The other one is a completely on a different side. All the great things that Rafi talked about, like anything human being have great about this one, it could create a huge social problem. It's going to make the difference between the haves and haves not in a big way. What would people do when everything run by smart machines?
Unemployment.
I think the big role, part of it is technology, part of it is how to do that is education. And the whole way of we educating our people, it's kind of amazing that schools looks about almost the same as it did. Not from the outside look, it's all bright and nice and wonderful things. Like when I went to school in September 1st, 1959. And the world is way different, the amount of changes. If I had time, I would read something interesting, but I don't. The jobs that these companies are looking for are not described as we looking for an engineer who know how to program Python. I'm looking for someone that will inspire me, will come do the job, will work independent. I cannot give them a job description. I can give them a vision and they'll go do whatever they do in a similar fashion Rafi and I talked about. But how we teach the 10% of the people that the Technion could bring, we teach 90% of the people to work that way, because the way things are going to be going forward in the digital age, going to be that way. I think it's, my view, one of the biggest challenge.
So we'll conclude this segment with our amazing guests. And I'll just mention that Rafi and I have completed editing, preparing our book, Aspiration, Inspiration, Perspiration. And in a very short time, we'll be able to provide copies of it for all those who are interested. 100 innovators tell their stories and they make recommendations. I have on my screen an amazing list of questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we will. Our guests will respond to all of them by email, and we promise to do that. And now I'm going to turn the broadcast, the webcast, back to you, Eric, to close our session, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shlomo and Rafi and Dadi, for this really fascinating conversation. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I wish we had several hours together. I'm personally looking forward to the new book coming out, to its publication, and to learn more about all these incredible people that you had the opportunity to interview. And I'm sure our viewers feel the same way. To everybody, our speakers have offered to answer your questions, as Shlomo mentioned, the questions that were in the chat. But in addition, if you have other questions, you can send them to programs@ats.org, and we will get back to you with answers. Also, the program has been recorded, so you can listen to it again, or have someone else who missed it have a chance to listen to it. So thank you all for joining us today, and for joining us for all the Live from Technion programs that we've offered over these last 16 months. This is the final national program in the series for this summer, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime in the fall, and of course to getting together in person as soon as possible. So thank you again and have a wonderful summer.